Okay, hello my little wormlings, my little dragonettes. Another week, another couple of chapters of the banned book. Volume. Pride, Prejudice, and Zombies! I almost didn't make it today because I have had like 4 hours of sleep. Of course, work. And I've also been kind of elbow deep in sewing supplies. Yay, I sound good. I've been elbow deep in all my fabric because everybody's having babies. And instead of buying gifts, I've been making them lately. So, yeah. I still got my sewing machine out. And all of that fun stuff. Also, I forgot to upload the last set of chapters onto YouTube. My bad. I'll fix that. I don't know when. Well, probably when I get my head out of the sewing machine. Well, when you do, I've got a butt clip. You know, I've got. Let me just move things around so I can get better light. There we go. Okay, chapter 15. Mr. Collins was not a sensible man, and that he... I'm shedding. Well... Oh, wow, Yeah, no, Madam Franklin does not have any ankle biters. It's the woman who comes to cut our hair. Both her daughters are ready to pop shortly. So, since I've been working on the stuff for your coworker, Lord Shenanigans, Mom's like, oh, let's make some for the, these are the, ankle biters. And so I've got, well, you know what? We have time. I've got, since one of them is going to be named Leia, as in, yes, Princess Leia, I had leftover cloth from another baby shower a couple of years ago. I think this little one is 2 now, but either way, the father and mother were big Star Wars fan, even though then they didn't name the... But yeah, I'm gonna make these. I've got 4. There was enough left over to make 4 with the... But the other mother is more of a flower theme, and I don't have any flower cloth, so I'm gonna have to go. Yeah, that's why I was like elbow deep in my sewing fabrics, because I was just like, do I have anything that's got flowers on it? Which I don't. So I'm gonna have to go to Joanne Fabrics, raid Joanne Fabrics. Also, probably raid Goodwill for backing, because, yeah. Either way. So I'm not gonna be done with sewing anytime soon. Not that I'm complaining. Okay. Chapter 15. Mr. Collins was not a sensible man, and the deficiency... Someone from the galaxy. Like, depends. It depends. If it's a boy or a girl. The only problem though is John Fabrics is going out of business, so I might have to resort to Amazon, which is sad because Amazon does not have a decent selection. Or, and I'm praying that they keep a at least a online presence so I can keep buying from them, because I would rather buy from them instead of Amazon or Michaels, because those two have shitty selections. Chapter 15. Mr. Collins was not a sensible man, and the deficiency of nature had been but little assisted by education or society, the greatest part of his life having been spent under the guidance of a brave but illiterate father. And though he belonged to one of the universities, he had oft borne the condemnation of his peers for a perceived lack of bloodlust. The subjection in which his father had brought him up had given him much knowledge of the art of combat, but it was a good deal counteracted by his weak head, fleshy figure, and now the ease of his current patronage. Ooh, I don't care if it's a Hispanic store. I love the little hole-in-the-wall ones. And I know there's another one on Bird Road. That's also very Hispanic. I can probably go to. I have to find that one. I might be doing that. Little mom and pop stores. Yes! I'm gonna need help with the translations, though. Are you willing to help me there, Madam Franklin? Are you willing to help be my translator? A fortunate chance had recommended him to Lady Catherine de Bourgh, who had been forced to behead her previous rector when he succumbed to the walking dead. Perfect. I'll let you know when I start planning trips out there. I'll make sure I do it on your days off so we can have a girls' day out. Because I'm in dire need of one. It's been so long. Having now a good house and a very sufficient income, he intended to marry. And in seeking a reconciliation with the Longbourn family, he had a wife in view, as he meant to choose one of the daughters if he found them as... I'm sorry. I'm going to probably be struggling reading this because, again, I fell asleep at 4 o'clock this morning. Thank you, work. And woke up at 8 o'clock this morning. Well, technically 9, so about 5 hours. And even though this is a zombie book, it is still Pride and Prejudice, and it is still very dry. And very wordy. Having now a good house and a very sufficient income, he intended to marry. And, in seeking a reconciliation with the Longbourn family, he had a wife in view, as he meant to choose one of the daughters if he found them as handsome and amiable as they were represented by common report. This was his plan of amends, of atonement, for inheriting their father's estate, and he thought an excellent one, full of eligibility and suitableness, and excessively generous on his own part. His plan did not vary on seeing them, The eldest daughter's lovely face and striking muscle tone confirmed his views, and for the first evening she was his settled choice. The next morning, however, made an alteration, for in a quarter of an hour's tete-a-tete with Mrs. Bennet before breakfast, a conversation beginning with his parsonage house and leading naturally to the avowal of his hopes that a mistress might be found for it at Longbourn, produced from her, amid a very complacent smile and general encouragement, a caution against the very Jane he had fixed on. As to her younger daughters, she could not take upon her to say. She could not positively answer, but she did not know of any prepossession. Her eldest daughter, she must just mention, she felt it incumbent on her to hint, was very likely, very soon, engaged. Elizabeth, equally next to Jane in birth and beauty, and perhaps surpassing her in skill, succeeded her, of course. Mrs. Bennet treasured up the hint, and trusted that she might soon have 2 daughters married, and the man whom she could not bear to speak of the day before was now high in her good graces. Lydia's intention of walking to Meryton was not forgotten. Every sister, except Mary, agreed to go with her, determined that she survived the trip. Mr. Collins was to attend them, at the request of Mr. Bennet, who was most anxious to get rid of him and have his library to himself. Mr. Collins used the walk to Meryton to his advantage, spending most of it at the side of Elizabeth, who was watching the surrounding woods, prepared to first sign of trouble with her brown Bess. Jane and the others followed behind, their muskets also thus engaged. Mr. Collins, who fancied himself a man of peace, carried neither barrel nor blade. He happily puffed away on his ivory and chestnut pipe, a gift from her ladyship, he boasted at every opportunity. They were scarcely a quarter-mile past the old croquet grounds when Elizabeth first caught the scent of death. Seeing her body tense, the other girls raised their muskets and closed rank, ready to meet an attack from any direction. Is there any trouble? Mr. Collins asked, who suddenly looked as if he might faint. Elizabeth pressed a finger to her lips and motioned for her sisters to follow. She led them along a set of carriage tracks, her footsteps so light as to leave even the smallest grain of sand undisturbed. The tracks continued for a few yards before suddenly veering towards the wood, where broken branches signaled the very spot it had left its wheels and plummeted into the ravine that paralleled one side of the road. Elizabeth peered over the side. Some 20 yards below, 8 or 9 blood-soaked zombies crawled over a shattered wagon and its leaking barrels. Most of them were busy picking at the innards of the carriage horse, but one happy dreadful was scooping the last morsels of the broken skull of the driver. A young girl, the sisters recognized at once. "Good heavens!" whispered Jane. "Penny McGregor! Oh, poor miserable girl! How often we warned her not to ride alone!" Penny McGregor had delivered lamp oil to Longbourn and most of the estates within 30 miles of Meryton, since she was scarcely old enough to talk. The McGregors owned a modest home not far from town, where they daily received cartfuls of whale blubber, and processed it into lamp oil and fine perfumes. The smell was unbearable, especially during summer, but their goods were desperately needed, and the McGregors were known to be among the most pleasant people in all of Hertfordshire. God have mercy on that wretched girl, said Mr. Collins, who had joined them. Can't we just be on our way? Asked Lydia. There's no helping her now. Besides, think of how dirty our dresses would get if we were to fight in that awful ravine. And fuck, there is a mosquito. Oh, God. If we have a fight in that awful ravine. As Jane expressed her shock at such a sentiment, and Kitty argued in favor of it, Elizabeth took the pipe from Mr. Collins' mouth, blew on the glowing tobacco, and threw it over the side. That was a gift from her ladyship, he cried, loud enough to draw the attention of the zombies below. They looked up and let loose their terrible roars, which were cut short by a violent, fiery explosion as pipe and oil met. Suddenly engulfed, the zombies staggered about, flailing wildly and screaming as they cooked. Jane raised her brown bess, but Elizabeth pushed the barrel aside. Let them burn, she said. Let them have a taste of eternity. Turning to her cousin, who had averted his eyes, she said, You see, Mr. Collin, God has no mercy, and neither must we. Though angered by her blasphemy, he thought better of saying anything on the matter, for he saw in Elizabeth's eyes a kind of darkness, a kind of absence, as if her soul had taken leave, so that compassion and warmth could not interfere. Upon entering Meryton, after stopping at the McGregors to deliver the unhappy news, the eyes of the younger ones were immediately wandering up in the street in quest of the officers, and nothing less than a very smart bonnet indeed, or the wail of the undead, could recall them. But the attention of every lady was soon caught by a young man whom they had never seen before, of most gentlemanlike appearance, walking with another officer on the other side of the way. The other officer, Mr. Denning, was known to Lydia, and he bowed as they passed. All were struck with the stranger's air. All wondered who he could be, and Kitty and Lydia, determined to find out, led the way across the street, under pretense of wanting something in an opposite shop, and fortunately had just gained the pavement when the two gentlemen, turning back, had reached the same spot. Mr. Denning addressed them directly and entreated permission to introduce his friend Mr. Wickham, who had returned with him the day before from town, and he was happy to say had accepted a commission in their corps. Corps. Corpse. C-O-R-P-S. I think it's pronounced corpse, but, corp. No, well, sorry. This was exactly as it should be, for the young man wanted only regimentals to make him completely charming. His appearance was greatly in his favor. He had all the best parts of beauty, a fine countenance, a good figure, and very pleasing address. The introduction was followed up on his side by a happy readiness of conversation, a readiness at the same time perfectly correct and unassuming, and the whole party was still standing and talking together very agreeably when the sound of horses drew their notice, and Darcy and Bingley were seen riding down the street. On distinguishing the ladies of the group, the two gentlemen came directly towards them and began the usual civilities. Bingley was the principal spokesman, and Jane Bennet the principal object. He was then, he said, on his way to Longbourn, on purpose to inquire after her. Mr. Darcy corroborated it with a bow, and was beginning to determine not to fix his eyes on Elizabeth, when they were suddenly arrested by the sight of the stranger. Elizabeth happened to see the countenance of both as they looked at each other, so slight as to escape all but her highly trained eye. Both changed color. One looked white, and the other red. Mr. Wickham, after a few moments, touched his hat, a salutation with which Mr. Darcy just designed to return. Elizabeth could tell by the minuscule twitches of Darcy's sword hand that he had briefly flirted with the notion of drawing his blade. What could be the meaning of this? In another minute, Mr. Bingley, without seeming to have noticed what passed, took leave and rode on with his friend. Mr. Denning and Mr. Wickham walked with the young ladies to the door of Mr. Phillip's house, then made their bows, in spite of Miss Lydia's pressing entreaties that they should come in, and even in spite of Mrs. Phillips throwing up the parlor window and loudly seconding the invitation. Mrs. Phillips was always glad to see her nieces, and the two eldest, from their recent absence, were particularly welcomed. Her civility was claimed towards Mr. Collins by Jane's introduction of him. She received him with her best politeness, which he returned with as much more, apologizing for his intrusion, without any previous acquaintance with her. She received him with her very best politeness, which he returned with as much more, apologizing for his intrusion, without any previous acquaintance with her. Mrs. Phillips was quite awed by such an excess of good breeding, but her contemplation of one stranger was soon put to an end by explanations and inquiries about the other, of whom, however, she could only tell her nieces what they already knew, that Mr. Denning had brought him from London, and that he was to have a lieutenant's commission in the regiment which was presently engaged to the north. She had been watching him the last hour, she said, as he walked up and down the street, and had Mr. Wickham appeared, Kitty and Lydia would certainly have continued the occupation, but unlikely no one passed windows now except a few of the officers who, in comparison with the strangers, were becoming stupid, disagreeable fellows. Some of them were to dine with the Phillips the next day, and their aunt promised to make her husband call on Mr. Wickham and give him an invitation also, if the family from Longbourn would come in the evening. This was agreed to, and Mrs. Phillips protested that they would have a little bit of hot supper and a nice, comfortable, noisy game of crypt and coffin. The prospect of such delights was very cheering, and they parted in mutual good spirits. As they walked home, Elizabeth related to Jane what she had seen pass between the two gentlemen. But though Jane would have defended either or both had they appeared to be in the wrong, she could no more explain such behavior than her sister. Okay, that chapter was like nothing but walls of text. That was very long paragraphs. Okay, chapter 16. As no objection was made to the young people's engagement with their aunt, the coach conveyed Mr. Collins and his 5 cousins at a suitable hour to Meryton. As they passed the croquet grounds and the scorched acre of woods that marked Penny McGregor's final resting place, the idle chatter that had engaged them thus far was suddenly ended. For all 6 could think of nothing but the news which had only that morning reached them at Longbourn. Penny's father, mad with grief, had thrown himself into a vat of boiling perfume. By the time his apprentice pulled him out, he had been badly disfigured and rendered blind. Doctors were unsure if he would survive, or if the stench would ever leave him. All sat in reverent silence until they reached the outskirts of Meryton. Upon reaching their destination, Mr. Collins was at leisure to look around him and admire, and he was so much struck with the size and furniture of the apartment that he declared he might almost have supposed himself in one of Lady Catherine's drawing rooms. Mrs. Phillips felt all the force of the compliment, being herself quite aware of Lady Catherine's proclivity for slaying the sorry-stricken, which she thought exceeded that of her own nieces. In describing to her all of the grandeur of Lady Catherine and her mansion, which had received considerable improvements, including a grand dojo and new quarters for her private guard of ninjas, Mr. Collins was happily employed until the gentlemen joined them, and he found in Mrs. Phillips a very attentive listener, whose opinions of his consequence increased with what she had heard, and who was resolving to retail it all among her neighbors as soon as she could. To the girls who could not listen to their cousin without taking silent inventory of the countless ways they could kill him, the interval of waiting appeared very long. It was over at last, however. The gentleman did approach, and when Mr. Wickham walked into the room, Elizabeth felt as if she had just been stunned by a devastating roundhouse kick. Such was his effect on her, and those traits of her sex, despite all her training, remained susceptible to influence. The officers of the Shire were in general a very creditable, gentlemanlike set, but Mr. Wickham was far beyond them all in person, countenance, air, and walk, as they were supposed to be superior in the broad-faced, stuffy Uncle Phillips, breathing port wine. But Mr. Wickham was as far beyond them all in person, countenance, air, and walk, as they were superior to the broad-faced, stuffy Uncle Phillips, breathing port wine, who followed them into the room. That was a very long sentence. Again, I'll say this again. The book is fun. It's, it's all fun and games. It's, taking something that is supposed to be a iconic romance story set in the Regency era and adding little bits of Japanese when Japan was still technically cut off from the rest of the world. I mean, I'm suspending disbelief here, and I'm enjoying the ride, but at the same time, I can't, because my history nerd in me is just like, no, This is wrong. The timelines do not match up. But then who cares? Because ninjas and samurai swords. And again, long, dry, stuffy wording. This is very hard. This book is, I swear, it's just like not far from what's the one that I'm gonna have to get back to. Oh yes, Middlemarch, with it's just nothing but paragraph on paragraph on paragraph of absolutely nothing except for descriptions and run-on sentences, and oh my god, I need to breathe. Mr. Wickham was the happy man towards whom almost every female eye was turned, and Elizabeth was the happy woman by whom he finally seated himself, and the agreeable manner in which he immediately fell into conversation, though it was only on it being a wet night made her feel that the commonest, dullest, most threadbare topic might be rendered interesting by the skill of the speaker. With such rivals for the notice of the fair as Mr. Wickham and the officers, Mr. Collins seemed to sink into insignificance. To the young ladies he certainly was nothing, but he had still at intervals a kind listener in Mrs. Phillips, and was by her watchfulness most abundantly supplied with coffee and muffin. When the card tables were placed, he had the opportunity of obliging her in turn by sitting down to Crypt and Coffin. Mr. Wickham did not play at Crypt and Coffin, and with ready delight was he received at the other table between Elizabeth and Lydia. At first there seemed danger of Lydia engrossing him entirely, for she was a most determined talker. But being likewise extremely fond of cards, she soon grew too much interested in the game, too eager to know whether the players would find their crypts eerily empty or their coffins happily full. Allowing for the common demands of the game, Mr. Wickham was therefore at leisure to talk to Elizabeth, and she was very willing to hear him, though what she chiefly wished to hear she could not hope to be told: the history of his acquaintance with Mr. Darcy. She dared not even mention that gentleman. Her curiosity, however, was unexpectedly relieved. Mr. Wickham began the subject himself. He inquired how far Northumberland was from Meryton, and after receiving her answer, asked in a hesitating manner how long Mr. Darcy had been staying there. "About a month," said Elizabeth. "He is a man of many kills, I understand." "Yes," replied Mr. Wickham. "His talent as a warrior is above reproach. You could not have met with a person more capable of giving you certain information on that head. You could not have met with a person more capable of giving you certain information on that head than myself, for I have been connected with his family in a peculiar manner from my infancy." Elizabeth could not but look surprised. "You may well be surprised, Miss Bennet, as such an assertion, after seeing, as a lady of your training probably might, the very cold manner of our meeting yesterday. Are you much acquainted with Mr. Darcy?" Wording. I swear to God, did they talk like this in the Regency time? Because if they did, it just As much as I ever wished to be, cried Elizabeth very warmly, I have spent 4 days in the same house with him, and I think him very disagreeable. I have no right to give my opinion, said Wickham, as to his being agreeable or otherwise. I am not qualified to form one. I have known him too long and too well to be a fair judge. It is impossible for me to be impartial, but I believe your opinion of him would in general astonish, and perhaps you would not express it quite so strongly anywhere else other than here in your own family. Upon my word, I say no more here than I might say in any house in the neighborhood, except Netherfield. He is not at all liked in Hertfordshire. Everyone is disgusted with his pride. I hope your plans in favor of this shire will not be affected by his being in the neighborhood. Oh, no, it is not for me to be driven away by Darcy. If he wishes to avoid seeing me, he must go. We are not on friendly terms, and it always gives me pain to meet him, but I have no reason for avoiding him. We are, after all, both warriors, and it is beneath the honor of a warrior to shrink from the sight of any man. His father, Miss Bennet, the late Mr. Darcy, was one of the best zombie slayers that ever breathed, and the truest friend I ever had. And I can never be in company with this Mr. Darcy without being grieved by 1,000 tender recollections. His behavior to myself has been scandalous, but I believe I could forgive him anything, rather than his disappointing the hopes and disgracing the memory of his father. Elizabeth found the interest of the subject increase, and listened with all her heart, but the delicacy of it prevented further inquiry. Mr. Wickham began to speak on more general topics, Meryton, the neighborhood, the society, appearing highly pleased with all that he had yet seen, excluding, of course, the ever-increasing numbers of unmentionables, no doubt a direct consequence of Manchester's collapse. A military life is not what I was intended for, but circumstances have now made it unavoidable, as they have for so many who intended otherwise with their lives. The church ought to have been my profession. I was brought up for the church, and I should at this time have been in possession of a most valuable living, had it pleased the gentleman we were speaking of just now. Indeed? Yes, the late Mr. Darcy bequeathed me the next presentation of the best living in his gift. He was my godfather, and excessively attached to me. I cannot do justice to his kindness. He meant to provide for me ample, and though he had done it, and thought he had done it, but when he was slain in the second battle of Kent, it was given elsewhere. Good heavens! Cried Elizabeth. But how could that be? How could his will be disregarded? Why did you not seek legal redress? There was just such an informality in the terms of the bequest as to give me no hope from the law. A man of honor could not have doubted the intention, but Mr. Darcy chose to doubt it, or to treat it as a merely conditional recommendation, and to assert that I had forfeited all claim to it by extravagance, imprudence, in short, anything or nothing. But the fact is that we are very different sort of men, and that he hates me. That is quite shocking. He deserves to be felled at the end of a Zatoichi cane sword. Again, Sometime or other he will be, and it shall not be by me. Till I can forget his father, I can never expose him or challenge him to a duel. Elizabeth honored him for such feelings and thought him handsomer than ever as he expressed them. But what, said she after a pause, could have been his motive? What can have induced him to behave so cruelly? A thorough, determined dislike of me, a dislike which I cannot but attribute to some measure of jealousy. Had the late Mr. Darcy liked me less, his son might have borne with me better. But his father's uncommon attachment to me irritated him, I believe, very early in life. He could find no fault with me, and I dare say it drove Darcy to resent my very existence. And when his father passed, he saw his opportunity to punish me for years of perceived injustice. I had not thought Mr. Darcy so bad as this. I thought I had never liked him. I never suspected him of descending to such malicious revenge, such injustice, such inhumanity as this. Mr. Wickham related to Elizabeth a tale from his youth, which he believed best illustrated the nature of that inhumanity. When he and Darcy were both boys of no more than 7 years, the elder Darcy had taken a keen interest in their training. One day, during a daybreak spar, the young Wickham landed a severe kick which sent Darcy to the ground. The elder Darcy implored Wickham to finish his son with a blow to the throat. When the boy protested, the elder Darcy, rather than punishing him for his insolence, praised his generosity of spirit. The young Darcy, embarrassed more by his father's preference than his own defeat, attacked Wickham when his back was turned, sweeping his legs with a quarter shaft and shattering the bones of both. It was nearly a year before he could walk without the aid of a cane. Could such abominable pride as ever... Can such abominable pride as his ever done him good? Yes, it has often led him to be liberal and generous, to give his money freely, to display hospitality, to assist his tenants, and relieve the poor. He has also brotherly pride, which, with some brotherly affection, makes him a very kind and careful guardian of his sister. What sort of girl is Miss Darcy? He shook his head. I wish I could call her amiable. It gives me pain to speak ill of a Darcy, but she is too much like her brother, very, very proud. As a child she was affectionate and pleasing, and extremely fond of me, and I had devoted hours and hours to her amusement. But she is nothing to me now. She is a handsome girl, about 15 or 16, and I understand, highly skilled in the deadly arts. Since her father's death, her home has been in London, where a lady lives with her and superintends... Since her father's death, her home has been in London, where a lady lives with her and superintends her training. After many pauses and many trials of other subjects, Elizabeth could not help reverting once more to the first, and saying, I am astonished at his intimacy with Mr. Bingley. How can Mr. Bingley, who seems good humour itself, and is, I really believe, truly amiable, be in a friendship with such a man? How could they suit each other? Do you know Mr. Bingley? Not at all. He is a sweet-tempered, amiable, charming man. He cannot know what Mr. Darcy is. The crypt and coffin party soon afterwards breaking up. Okay, sorry. The wording of this sentence is just, again, not how modern English is spoken or written. So I just have to be like, I'm sorry, ash.exe has stopped working for a second. The crypt and coffin party soon afterwards breaking up, the players gathered around the other table, and Mr. Collins took his station between his cousin, Elizabeth, and Mrs. Phillips. The usual inquiries as to his success was made by the latter. It had not been very great. He had found the majority... Oh. Okay, so this is talking about the card game. Oh, I think it's a card game. They were talking about card tables. The crypt and coffin party soon afterwards breaking up. The players gathered round the other table, and Mr. Collins took his station between his cousin Elizabeth and Mrs. Phillips. The usual inquiries as to his success was made by the latter. It had not been very great. He had found the majority of his crypts full of zombies. But when Mrs. Phillips began to express her concern thereupon, he assured her with much earnest gravity that it was not of the least importance, that he can consider the money as a mere trifle, and begged that she would not make herself uneasy. I know very well, madam, he said, that when persons sit down to a game of crypt and coffins, they must take their chances of these things, and happily I am not in such circumstances as to make 5 shillings any object. There are undoubtedly many who cannot say the same, but thanks to Lady Catherine de Bourgh, I am removed far beyond the necessity of regarding little matters. Mr. Wickham's attention was caught, and after observing Mr. Collins for a few moments, he asked Elizabeth in a low voice whether her relation was very intimately acquainted with the family of de Bourgh. Lady Catherine de Bourgh, she replied, has very lately given him a living. I hardly know how Mr. Collins was first introduced to her notice, but he certainly has not known her long. You know, of course, that Lady Catherine de Bourgh and Lady Anne Darcy were sisters, consequently that she is aunt to the present Mr. Darcy. No, indeed, I did not. I knew only of Catherine's claim to quieting more of Satan's servants than any woman in England. Her daughter, Miss de Bourgh, will have a very large fortune, and it is believed that she and her cousin will unite the 2 estates. This information made Elizabeth smile, as she thought of poor Miss Bingley. Vain indeed must be all her attention, vain and useless her affection for his sister, and her praise of Mr. Darcy himself, unaware that he was already destined for another. Mr. Collins, said Elizabeth, speaks highly both of Lady Catherine and her daughter, but I suspect his gratitude misleads him, and that in spite of her being his patroness and a great warrior, she is an arrogant and conceited woman. I believe her to be both in great degree, replied Wickham. I have not seen her for many years, but I very well remember that I never liked her, and that her manners were dictatorial and insolent. She has the reputation of being remarkably skilled, but I rather believe she derives part of her fame from her rank and fortune. Elizabeth allowed that he had given a very rational account of it, and they continued talking together with mutual satisfaction till supper put an end to cards, and gave the rest of the ladies their share of Mr. Wickham's attentions. There could be no conversation in the noise of Mrs. Phillips' supper party, but his manners recommended him to everybody. Whatever he said was said well, and whatever he did, done gracefully. Elizabeth went away with her head full of him. She could think of nothing but of Mr. Wickham, and of what he had told her all the way home. But there was not time for her even to mention his name as they went, for she and her sisters could hear the groans of unmentionables echoing through the pitch-black woods on either side of the carriage. They were distant enough so as not to arouse a fear of imminent attack, but close enough to necessitate a minimum of noise. They rode in silence. The girls with their firearms rested neatly on their lap. For once, Mr. Collins could not be persuaded to make a sound. Ugh, okay, that was a long chapter. Oh, jeez. So like I said, it's been a while since I've read Pride and Prejudice, so I know Jane gets with Mr. Bingley, Elizabeth gets with Mr. Darcy, yeah. Mr. Wickham, one of the three run off with him. One gets married to a soldier. And I forgot what happens to the last one. And I think, granted it's, again, been a while, but Mr. Wickham is a skirt chaser, if I can remember correctly. Only wants the money. And so he thinks with the cousin being close to Miss Catherine de Bourgh, the Bennets have, little in the pocket. But we all know they do not. It's been about an hour. How much left is chapter 17? Chapter 17 is short. But chapter 18 is long. Okay, so I'll get to at least chapter 18 and call it a day. I would have liked to have read more, but that one chapter really just... It's like word salad. Elizabeth related to Jane the next day what had passed between Mr. Wickham and herself. Jane listened with astonishment and concern. She knew not how to believe that Mr. Darcy could be so unworthy of Mr. Bingley's regard. And yet, it was not in her nature to question the veracity of a young man of such amiable... Excuse me. You know, the moment you start going halfway through a sentence and then the carbonation in your drink just wants to come right back up. Elizabeth related to Jane the next day what had passed between Mr. Wickham and herself. Jane listened with astonishment and concern. She knew not how to believe that Mr. Darcy could be so unworthy of Mr. Bingley's regard, and yet it was not in her nature to question the veracity of a young man of such amiable appearance as Wickham. The possibility of his having his leg shattered was enough to interest all her tender feelings, and nothing remained to be done but to think well of them both, to defend the conduct of each, and to throw into the account of accident or mistake whatever could not be explained otherwise. They have both, she said, been deceived in some way or another. Interested people have perhaps misrepresented each other. Interested people have perhaps misrepresented each to the other. It is impossible for us to conjecture the cause which may have alienated them without actual blame on either side. Very true indeed. And now, my dear Jane, what have you got to say on behalf of the interested people who have probably been concerned in the business? Do clear them too, or shall we be obliged to think ill of somebody? Laugh as much as you choose, but I will not laugh. but you will not laugh me out of my opinion. My dearest Lizzie, do but consider in what a disgraceful light it places Mr. Darcy, to be treating his father's favourite in such a manner, one whom his father had trained in the deadly arts, and promised to provide for. It is impossible. I can much more easily believe Mr. Bingley's being imposed on than that Mr. Wickham should invent such a history of himself as he gave me last night. Names, facts, everything mentioned without ceremony. If it not be so, let Mr. Darcy contradict it. Besides, well, there was truth in his looks. It is difficult indeed. It is distressing. One does not know what to think. I beg your pardon, one knows exactly what to think. But Jane could think with certainty on only one point, that Mr. Bingley, if he had been imposed on, would have much to suffer when the affair became public, and may even feel a duel necessary to restore his honour. She could hardly bear the thought. The two young ladies were summoned from the dojo where this conversation passed by the arrival of the very persons of whom they had been speaking. Mr. Bingley and his sister came to give their personal invitation for the long-expected ball at Netherfield, which was fixed for the following Tuesday. Jane and Elizabeth was embarrassed to receive callers in their sparring gowns, but their usual appearance did not deter the ladies from being delighted to see them. Jane and Elizabeth were embarrassed to receive callers in their sparring gowns, but their unusual appearance did not deter the ladies from being delighted to see them, particularly their dear friend Jane. Oh, it's Mr. Bingley and his sisters. I read it as sister. The ladies called it an age since they had met, and repeatedly asked what she had been doing with herself since their separation. To the rest of the family they paid little attention, avoiding Mrs. Bennet as much as possible, saying not much to Elizabeth and nothing at all to the others. They were soon gone again, rising from their seats with an activity which took their brother by surprise, and hurrying off as if eager to escape from Mrs. Bennet's civilities. The prospects of the Netherfield ball were extremely agreeable to every female of the family. Mrs. Bennet chose to consider it as given in compliment to her eldest daughter, and was particularly flattered by receiving the invitation from Mr. Bingley himself, instead of a ceremonious card. Jane pictured to herself a happy evening in the society of her two friends, and the attention of their brother, and Elizabeth thought with pleasure of dancing a great deal with Mr. Wickham, and of seeing a confirmation of everything in Mr. Darcy's look and behaviour. Elizabeth's spirits were so high on this occasion that though she did not often speak unnecessarily to Mr. Collins, she could not help asking him whether he intended to accept Mr. Bingley's invitation, and if he did, whether he would think it proper to join in the evening's amusement. And she was rather surprised to find that he entertained no scruples whatever on that hand, and was very far from dreading a rebuke from either the Archbishop or Catherine de Bourgh by venturing to dance. "I am by no means of the opinion," said he, "that a ball of this kind, given by a young man of character, can have any evil tendency, and I shall hope to be honoured with the hands of all my fair cousins in the course of the evening, and I take this opportunity of soliciting yours, Miss Elizabeth, for the first two dances especially, a preference which I trust my cousin Jane will attribute to the right cause, and not to any disrespect for her." Elizabeth felt herself completely taken in. She had fully proposed to be engaged by Mr. Wickham for those dances, and to have Mr. Collins instead? Her liveliness had never been worse timed. There was no help for it, however. Mr. Wickham's happiness and her own were perforce delayed a little longer, and Mr. Collins' proposal accepted with as good grace as she could. She was soon after afflicted with a most palpable urge to vomit, and politely cupped her hands lest the sight of her sick distressed the present party. Thankfully, the urge subsided quickly, but the realization that invited it remained. Did this fat little priest mean to take her as his wife? She was horrified at the thought of marrying a man whose only skill with a blade was cutting slivers of gorgonzola. If there had not been another field ball to prepare for, the younger Miss Bennets would have been in a very pitiable state, for from the day of the invitation to the day of the ball, there was such a succession of rain as prevented their walking to Merton once. The earth was again soft and the dead numerous. No aunt, no officers, no news could be sought after. Even Elizabeth might have found some trial of her patience in weather which totally suspended the improvement of her acquaintance with Mr. Wickham, and nothing less than a dance on Tuesday could have made such a Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and Monday endurable to Kitty and Lydia. Alright, and with that, I'm going to call it a day. Alright, thank you for coming and listening to my rambles and attempts to read this book. I will see you all next time. Hopefully I'll see you live if you come and join me on Wednesdays. If not, this video on YouTube, complete with all my ramblings prior to the actual reading as I catch up with my friends. Alright, take care, my little dragonettes. Bye-bye.